Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Maartje.
And we like World War II media and we want to talk about it.
This episode contains mentions of sexual assault. Proceed with caution. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are talking about Catch-22 and specifically about the book which came out in 1961. And we have a guest this week, our friend and internet history nerd, Phoebe. Welcome to the show, Phoebe.
Hi.
You like this book, don't you?
Yeah, I read it around a year ago, so I may be a bit rusty, but I remember enough that I can talk about it, so I'm happy to be here.
It's worth noting that Phoebe is a big lit person who's read a lot of novels in this vein, so we'll definitely have lots of stuff to contribute, which I'm excited about.
All right, I'll refresh your memories by reading you some stuff about the book. It was written by Joseph Heller, and it's a satirical novel about Captain John Yossarian, an American bombardier stationed in Italy during World War II. It's based on experiences of Joseph Heller, who flew 60 bombing missions from May to October in 1944. That's a lot. It was also adapted to film in 1970, which was directed by Mike Nichols, and for TV in 2019, which was produced by George Clooney. And it has remained in print since publication and has sold over 10 million copies.
There's also a special 50th anniversary edition that was released a couple years ago that has all the extras in the back, so I would recommend it if any of you guys get the chance to read that version.
Yeah, I gather it was a bit of a sleeper hit when it came out, some mixed reviews on it, and then it became a cult classic. So there's a quote that I'm going to read to you from the book, both because it will give you an idea of Heller's writing style if you haven't read the book, and also because it's crucial to know what Catch-22 is. And so I'll read you this little quote. There was only one catch, and that was Catch-22, which specified that a concern for one's safety in the face of dangers that were real and immediate was the process of a rational mind, or was crazy and could be grounded. All he had to do was ask, and as soon as he did, he would no longer be crazy and would have to fly more missions, or would be crazy to fly more missions and sane if he didn't, but if he were sane, he had to fly them. If he flew them, he was crazy and didn't have to, but if he didn't want to, he was sane and had to. Yossarian was moved very deeply by the absolute simplicity of this clause of Catch-22 and let out a respectful whistle. That's some catch, that Catch-22, he observed. It's the best there is, Dr. Nika agreed.
The entire book is like this.
Yeah, it's very verbose. It feels like Heller could easily say something in 3 words. He chooses to say it in 30 words instead, which is why it's a 600-page book about the same events happening over and over again, pretty much.
Yeah, so let's give a quick review, just first impressions. Mart, what did you think of this book?
Well, just to give you an honest review, I must begin by saying that I have not read the entire book, but I read most of it. Not because I didn't enjoy it, but because I'm just a really slow reader and this book is really difficult to read. I enjoyed it. I probably would read it again, but with less of a time pressure on it, maybe. Or maybe just my favorite bits, because this book is not in chronological order, so you can just read it whatever way you want, if you so choose. And I think part of the charm is that it is not in chronological order, so I like that about it, but I also kind of struggled to connect to anyone in this book. Maybe that's not really the point of the book, I don't think it is. It's my first dabble into satire, so can't really compare it to anything, but I enjoyed it. How about you, Sam?
Yeah, I've read this book a couple of times. I saw the stage play a few years ago. I'm very fond of it. It's a masterclass in satire. It's really funny. It is a bit long. Heller gets a bit rambly in places, but yeah, no, I enjoy it. I'm excited to talk about it. How about you, Phoebe?
Yeah, I had been meaning to read it for so long, and I had a couple friends who really liked it and recommended it to me, and I also decided to read it kind of accidentally back to back with Len Deaton's Bomber, which was also about one mission of a British Lancaster bombing crew. And it's a very kind of serious kind of novel. I think it was really interesting kind of do the compare and contrast in my head, because Catch-22 is also very satirical and funny and it takes doesn't really take itself too seriously, even as it's a commentary on war. But overall, I think it definitely also took me a while to get into it. Once you start understanding the style and the characters and the satire, it starts to make sense, even if it doesn't really, you're kind of left wondering a little bit how to put it all together in your head.
So kind of the way the book is structured is you get all of these different chapters that are centered around one character. So you find out a lot about this huge kind of ensemble of characters. But in each chapter, you'll find a little bit about this plot line or that plot line. And then the last third of the book is really kind of those plot lines coming together and starting to actually understand what's happening. And I really enjoy that. I find the first maybe 60, 70% of the book, you're like, okay, like this is funny, not 100% where it's going. And then when you get to the part where everything starts to come together, I really, really enjoy that part. I find it like a real page turner.
It's interesting that you say that because I realize I've had a different experience to both of you because I've watched the TV show first, which is in chronological order. And then I read the book, so it made sense to me right away, obviously, because I knew what was going to happen in what order. So I didn't really have to puzzle. And I don't know if that's helpful or if that's hurting my experience of the book. I don't really know. But I then went on to read the book and then I watched the series again. So I've done kind of a 3-window thingy where I've seen the TV show, read the book, seen the TV show again.
What did you think of the TV show?
So I have two different opinions because when I watched it the first time, I didn't really get it because I wasn't aware so much about what Catch-22 was about. I didn't know it was satire. So then it started and it was really weird. And then it got really serious and then it got really weird again. So I'm like, what is this TV show trying to do? But then I read the book and then it made sense. And then I watched it again and I enjoyed it quite a lot more. So I really, really liked it, but I can understand. I see them as different things, right? I see the book as one thing and the TV show as something completely separate because you can't really compare the two. It's totally different.
Do you want my thoughts on the TV show? Because I have some thoughts.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I've only seen it once, and that was a few months ago, but I do remember that I found like the TV show does take itself too seriously. I think it forgets a bit that it's a satire and wants to be a drama. And I think I read somewhere that it has a lot of more focus on like the actual air combat than the book does. And I think that's like the whole main point of the book is all this absurdity of war doesn't necessarily happen when you're actually at like fighting someone else. It's just the rest, the whole being there experience, like the whole thing about how war is 90% boredom, 10% the most terrifying experience you've had in your life. And I feel like putting it in a linear order also misses a lot of the point because the whole point is that it doesn't make any sense, and putting it in logical order and also kind of like removes some of the impact of Snowden. Like we'll probably talk about that later at some point, but his death is a very key part of the book that Yossarian keeps coming back to. And by having it happen at the end, you miss all of Yossarian's previous breakdowns and his death loses that central impact.
Yeah, and they changed the ending of the show too, right?
Yeah, I was so mad about that.
We'll definitely talk about that later. But no, I pretty much agree with you. Yeah, I thought if you watched the show by itself, not as an adaptation of Catch-22, it's a good watch. I don't know. I enjoyed the watch, but I did have to separate it from Catch-22 in my mind because I don't think it's that great of an adaptation. And I actually did also watch the 1970 movie this weekend. And I actually thought the movie was kind of on the other end of things where it was almost too faithful to the book. And in that sense, it kind of fell a bit flat. And if you hadn't read the book, you might not be able to follow the movie that well. So I don't know, interesting, just totally different takes on it by two totally different directors/producers.
However, 2019 show, excellent soundtrack. So I will say that.
Also beautiful. It looks really, really pretty too. And I feel like it would have been good as a drama. Like not as an adaptation, but just a war drama. If they'd taken all the absurdity out of it completely, it would have been a good war drama. But it's trying to be both at the same time, and it doesn't work that way. I finished it today again, so I spent some time crying today over Snowden. They do start at the very end. There's one shot of Yossarian naked and bloody at the very beginning, but it's so brief that you forget it happens.
So one more thought on the show is that I know it's a show and they had limited budget and all that, but I feel like even by trying to make it a drama, they added in all these extra fight scenes and at the same time took away a lot of the important character moments from the book that I think could have been added into the show. I would have liked to see a bit longer. Like if you're going to commit entirely.
I just want to respond to that again because I thought the show did a better job at fleshing out the characters than the book did. I felt more emotionally connected to them, at least. Maybe that's because it's chronological order. Could be.
I also, like, the point of a lot of the characters in the book is not, like, really that we're supposed to connect to them. The point of a lot of them is they're supposed to, like, almost go so far above and beyond caricature that they, like, circle back around. So, you know, they're, like, and a lot of these characters are, like, symbolic of other things. So, yeah, I don't know. It's, like, interesting to me that you say that because I feel like, I don't know. I feel like it's not necessarily the, like, object point of the book.
No, it's not.
Except on a sort of broader level of we're supposed to see ourselves as the oppressed and the downtrodden alongside Yossarian and his friends. And that sort of like broader sense, but like specifically, I don't know that we're supposed to super closely relate to individual characters.
Yeah, I agree. I think they're mostly, it's the first one that comes to mind, obviously, is Milo is obviously symbolic. He's like a stereotypical war profiteer and military industrial complex and all of that. But I also was just actually thinking, because you were saying, say, change some things and characters in the show, I was actually thinking of Major DeCoverley. It's very interesting because I feel in the book, he's kind of that lurking background guy who we're not really supposed to be attached to. And that's what kind of draws Yossarian to him. And also the whole Major blank DeCoverley joke doesn't work in visual medium. And then in the show, he gets a lot more characterization that he doesn't really, there's no reason for him to get that characterization other than making him interesting on TV and that he's played by Hugh Laurie.
I'll say the scene where he walks into the hall and all the Nazis turn and look at him. I did laugh.
Yes. It's a kind of like, why am I laughing? This is, you know what's going to happen to him, but it's still funny.
Yeah. Okay, so before we get too far into this, let's give sort of a brief overview of the characters. It makes more sense probably to talk about individual characters than it does to talk about the plot, because as we've discussed, the plot doesn't really happen in any kind of coherent order. We've got our main character, Captain John Yossarian, and every time he gets close to the number of missions he needs to fly in order to go home, the number of required missions is raised. So he spends most of the novel trying to figure out how to avoid flying more missions. He's kind of a shit disturber, and we're supposed to sort of see him as the only sane person in the vicinity.
It's funny to me because Yossarian actually is the only character that you kind of get a sense of what he's feeling, especially towards the end of the book. You get a little glimpse of his actual feelings. So I did connect to him at the end. So the second character is Colonel Cathcart, and I've read this name out loud to myself 20 million times and I still can't say it. But he's group commander of the base. He's a deeply insecure man. His ambition drives him to continue raising the number of missions the men must fly. So he's basically very incompetent and uses the mission rate to try and get over it.
I can't believe I read the whole book and watched the whole show, and I finally realized that Colonel Corn was a pun.
Oh my God, it is a pun!
What?
Oh my God!
Because I had to hear it said out loud for it to make sense. And I was like,
Okay.
oh.
Yeah, so you know how there's like a corn kernel?
Oh, Colonel!
Oh my God. Okay, it can't be super, super obvious. I feel like one of the three of us would have noticed if it were super obvious. It's not on us. Hilarious. Yeah, Colonel Corn is Colonel Cathcart's sidekick, y'all.
Phoebe, do you want to let everybody know which day it is today and also introduce the next character for us?
Yes, for all of you out there who are in our time zone, it's not already tomorrow. We're recording this on Milo Monday. So introduce one of my favorite characters in the book because who am I if I'm not like the lover of stupid rat men? Lieutenant Milo Binderbinder. He is the best officer who builds a massive syndicate of which, quote, everybody has a share. And he is basically, like I said before, is a metaphor for the military-industrial complex and capitalism run amok.
Yeah.
He's always getting Yossarian into these ridiculous situations against his will.
He is. And the truly wild thing about him is that he's not an evil person by any means, but in his drive to make a profit, he does some like truly wild and evil things. So yeah, very symbolic. We also have the character of Major. And his name is actually Major, 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 and he gets promoted to Major by a computer error, which you can probably imagine. And as soon as he gets promoted to Major, all of the other men hate him because he outranks them and they don't want anything to do with him. So he basically hides out from everyone in his office, and his rule is that you're only allowed to come in and see him when he's not there.
I love this. In the TV show, this is actually my favorite character, but they also made him a little bit more likable, and he's also a friend to Yossarian, specifically a bit more than he is in the book. Yeah, it's really funny.
Yeah, I also kind of saw that apparently, this is a bit weird, but the actor playing Major, Major, Major has a bit of a fan base because he was in Top Gun Maverick.
Yes.
So I had no idea. I haven't seen that movie, but typecasting as the weird pilot guy, I guess.
Yeah.
I've seen him in all the things, and he's also always a nerd because in other stuff, he's also a nerd.
He has nerd face, to be fair. Sorry, Lewis Pullman, I think is his name.
Yeah. So we also have our doctor in this book. He's called Dr. Nika. He's a flight surgeon and a hypochondriac who is eventually listed as skilled in action due to a clerical error.
Yeah. In order to get his flight pay, he has to log a certain amount of flight hours. So he puts himself on this flight manifest of a plane that ends up going down. And so even though he's standing right there, they're like, well, you went down with that plane, actually. So you're dead.
Yeah.
And there's a running gag after that about writing condolence letters to his wife. So
yeah, and she's not actually too bothered because she's collecting all these sweet insurance payouts and, payouts from this association and that association and this and that.
And one of the other characters is Chaplain Tapman, who's a friend of Yossarian, as close as anyone gets to really being a good person. And of course, Yossarian's censorship pranks wind up getting pinned on him. And he's also the subject of the really famous opening line, "It was love at first sight." And the next line is, "The first time Yossarian saw the chaplain, he fell madly in love with him." So that kind of sets the tone for what the rest of the book is about. And then we also have Lieutenant Nately, patriotic and romantic. Nately spends most of the book in love with a sex worker who wants nothing to do with him, called Nately's whore, until right before he is killed in a flying accident. And I think part of what the TV show missed about Nately is that a lot of the reason why he's like that is because he's canonically 19, and some of you misses that by he's played by someone who's obviously in his 30s. I have a soft spot for him, I will admit.
Y'all, I laughed so hard when I was writing the notes for this because I'm like, in the book, I don't think she has a name. She's just called Nately's whore the whole time. And I'm like, well, I don't really want to just call her a whore in the narration of my notes. So I've written sex worker, and I was just like laughing at myself.
Yeah, in the TV show, she gets named and she gets a bit of character as well. And you see quite a lot of her, more than in the book anyway.
Yeah, well, actually, in the movie, in the opening scene, Yossarian gets stabbed by Nately's whore. That's where they started out, like, you're just right in there. So
that's certainly a choice.
It is really a choice, yeah.
They were just doing all the drugs in the 70s.
Yeah. So we have a couple of characters who, in their own right, don't have a lot of characterization, but what happens to them is sort of a catalyst for a lot of the things that happen in Yossarian's character arc. So we have Snowden, who's a young radio gunner whose death Yossarian witnesses and obsesses over. And we also have Clevenger, who's this guy who's super rigid in his opinions. He's very optimistic. His plane vanishes into a cloud, and that's kind of a thing that gets picked up throughout the book. Yossarian thinks about that one a lot too.
I feel like Clevenger in the TV show is kind of Yossarian's best friend. They are really chummy. There are some other characters in the book that are on Yossarian's crew, like McWatt and Kit Sampson. These are both pilots, one of whom kills the other by accident in a really gruesome accident, and then flies himself into a mountain.
That scene was really visceral in the show. I think that is something that I really thought played out well on screen, because in the book, it's kind of just like, oh, this bad thing happened. You kind of like imagine it in your head, but in the show, you get all the blood and guts and kind of try to emphasize that this is a big deal, more so than some of the other on-screen deaths.
Did we mention Dunbar, or did I just miss that?
No, I didn't. I didn't list all the characters.
All right, so Dunbar is another one of those in Yossarian's friend groups, and in the TV show, he also gets a very gruesome death. So they pull no punches when it comes to blood and gore in the TV show.
Yeah, the one thing about the McWatt Kid Samson thing in the book is that up until then, there hasn't been any sort of like viscerally violent things like that have happened. There's sort of like things have been alluded to, but that's kind of the first one where it's like you're just reading, you're just enjoying the Joseph Heller experience, and then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, and then McWatt flew his plane into this guy. Sprayed his guts all over everywhere. He got cut in half. His legs were still standing up. And then after a minute, they fell down. And then McWatt flew his plane into a mountain. And you're like, Jesus Christ.
And while Yossarian is trying to, if I remember, he's trying to have sex with one of the nurses on the beach as this is happening.
Literally, he is.
Sex and violence. Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. And speaking of sex and violence, there's a character called Captain Aardvark. Everyone calls him Arfie. He's the navigator on Yossarian's crew. He's a sort of like Ivy League social climber type. He's quote unquote not smart enough to be afraid of the war. And he's the perpetrator of a rape and murder later in the novel. That's sort of the part of this climactic coalescence of horrible events that lead Yossarian to decide that he's getting the fuck out of there.
In the TV show, they also picture the rape. It's pretty brutal. It's also done in a way where it coincides with something that's happening to Yossarian outside. So they do it in a nice cinematic way. But it's still pretty horrible. But it's meant to be horrible, so I think they do it quite well. Yeah, Arfie, I never want to see your smug face again.
I forgot the juxtaposition happened until you brought it up, actually. I did remember thinking it was interesting while I was watching it.
Yeah. In the book, we have Yossarian, and he's like walking the streets of Rome, and all of his friends are dead. And he sees someone beating a dog, and then he sees a woman like about to get gang raped, and then he sees someone beating a kid, and he's just seeing all these terrible things and realizing what kind of a place the world is, or not realizing, but it's kind of like really sinking in. Like he's just seeing all these terrible things one after the other. And then he gets back to where they're staying, and there's just like this dead girl in the street that Arfie has killed. So yeah, that part of the novel is pretty dark.
I do like the way Heller writes Yossarian's questioning the world in that scene, because it's 2 pages of him questioning if all good people are going to turn out to be bad people, if all lucky people are going to turn out to be unlucky, and he does all these contradictions in the book, and it's quite interesting to read it that way, and it really hits home for me. There's some high brass in the show as well. We get Generals Peckham, Dreedle, and Scheisskopf, which means shithead, in case you don't know. They are largely apathic to the war effort and focused on outdoing each other with stupid parades and embarrassing a son-in-law and other very unimportant matters. They are very annoying.
These guys are the absolute representation of, in as much as this book is anti-war and fundamentally anti-establishment, these are the guys who keep doing nonsensical things that put other people's lives in danger, and it just doesn't seem to matter. And no matter what anyone else does, like their say doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, and lastly, one of the most important characters we have, Orr, who's a pilot who shares Yossarian's tent and is described as grinning and crazy, who survives his plane being shot down and escapes to Sweden, which functions as a shining beacon of freedom for Yossarian at the end of the book. After all his other friends have died, he kind of begins to realize, oh, maybe we're all not all going to die. There is a good ending for me. And he's also the crab apples in his cheeks guy, which is one of the funniest parts of the book.
Yeah. This book is really, really funny in places. And for anyone who hasn't read the book, it has a sort of ambiguous ending. So Yossarian decides that he's going to get the fuck out of there and then, makes the attempt, and we don't find out what happens to him. But actually, Joseph Heller did write a sequel that came out in the 90s. So we know that Yossarian got away and he got away safely. But yeah, we don't necessarily know that at the end of the novel.
Can I do one honorable mention for one of my favorite almost non-characters in the book, which is the dead man in Yossarian's tent?
Oh, yeah. He also gets a name in the show. A lot of the unnamed characters.
I think he gets a name in the book as well. They mention him. His name is Mudd.
Oh, yeah. Henry Mudd, right?
Yeah. He gets referred to the wrong tent, and as a result has to go and fly before he's even unpacked all his stuff in the tent. And the brass can't be bothered to kind of do his paperwork after he's dead, so his stuff just stays in the tent. It took me a while to realize that there wasn't a ghost in the tent, but it was just the stuff of a guy that had died.
That's basically a ghost, I would say.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anything is a ghost if you try hard enough.
It's one of the many, many illogical bureaucracy things in Catch-22 where because the guy went up to fly before he was registered, everyone was like, well, since he wasn't registered, he wasn't really here. And Yossarian's like, well, he was here. All his shit is here. And they're like, but he wasn't really here to register. On paper, he wasn't here.
Yeah.
Schrodinger's pilot, same with Dr. Nika, either alive or dead, the secret third thing in bureaucratic purgatory.
Let's talk a little bit more, I guess, in depth about the book. It obviously is about World War II, and it's based on a lot of Heller's personal experiences. He was also based in Italy. Viewers of Masters of the Air will find a pretty significant difference between the backdrop of dreary old England versus this island of Pianosa, Italy. They're all like swimming between missions. It's like this whole just super strange contrast between what they're going through when they fly missions and then they get back and then it's summer camp vacation. I don't know. It's interesting. It's a cool setting. So obviously it's about World War II, but it is really more of a commentary on the era in which it was written. So Heller started working on it, I think in 1953 or 54, and then it was published in 1961. So obviously Korea, Vietnam is kind of the context in which it hit the popular consciousness. So maybe we should talk about that a little bit. Does anyone have any initial thoughts?
Oh yeah, I think it's really interesting how, if you allow me to go literary for a minute here and start yapping at postmodernism, I think it's really interesting in that stylistically it's a rejection, like as we talked about before, of the establishment in like the literary world because of all the wordplay and the non-linear storytelling and the characters who aren't really characters. Like it's very much a standard of postmodernist literature, which is very post-World War II, post-1945 phenomenon. If you ever heard of the quote, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbarism," I think very much Catch-22 falls under that. It's kind of meta-commentary on how do we find meaning in an inherently meaningless world, and we're going to go laugh about it, even though it is very much not set in the time that it's written about.
Yeah, it is a really funny book, and a lot of the little scenarios, even though they're ridiculous, there's also this seriousness in the way that Colonel Cathcart keeps raising the missions so that even if you fly your missions and you follow the rules and do everything you're supposed to do, there's no way out of this system unless one of the higher ups decides that you get out of the system. But you can do everything right and you'll never get out. And so this kind of like broader commentary on the state of affairs is like, if you sit and think about it, you're like, this is a funny book about some pretty serious shit.
It was not super popular when it first came out, but it really exploded in popularity when the Vietnam War started ramping up in intensity. And I think I did read somewhere that was really popular among American soldiers in Vietnam because it's kind of like, oh, this is a different war, but kind of understands the inherent absurdity of our situation, which is very interesting to look back on. And also, if you wanted more of my postmodernist thoughts, I think it's also super interesting because it's often compared, like a compare and contrast to Slaughterhouse-Five, which is also another 1960s book about World War II. That's very satirical, but I don't think it's straight up outright as funny as Catch-22, but it is the same non-linear context. It's trying to make a commentary on the absurdity of post-war life and Vietnam, even though all of the statistics about Dresden are wrong, but that is a story for another time. So
yeah, if folks are not familiar with Slaughterhouse-Five, Kurt Vonnegut was a prisoner of war in Dresden during the firebombing. And so the novel is about a character who's fictional, but sort of based on those experiences where later in life, he becomes convinced that he's getting abducted by aliens, and it's like a metaphor for PTSD. But yeah, like the same sort of like non-linear thing. I agree, definitely not as funny, but it's super interesting when you look at the way that these two books sort of capture the popular imagination at this specific time in history.
There are some funny moments, not to get too off topic, but I think the one that I think of is Billy Pilgrim had an enormous wag. You never know who's going to be blessed with one or something like that. It's all this like a lot of the funniest moments are this very crude humor that I feel like is also very much a product of this is soldier talk, kind of how they're both written by ex-servicemen, which is very not really like a whole interesting thing, but it is interesting how they rely on that kind of dark humor.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to talk to us a bit about Catch-22 as a great American Jewish novel? I don't have like a ton of knowledge about this, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is also not something I have a ton of knowledge about, and kind of something it's very hard to explain. But I think, to quote Heller later on in an interview, Yossarian is largely an extension of my own sensibilities, and I am Jewish. Although he's not explicitly characterized as Jewish in the novel, it's kind of ambiguous whether he's given multiple times as Armenian or Assyrian. But I think very much, again, this is very hard to, it's a very abstract concept, but the idea of you could always walk out, you could always quit and just cope through your dark humor to kind of make sense of this inherently absurd situation that there is no way out of is very Jewish philosophy. I think, as we said before, about them changing the ending of the show, because the show very much, I think, has that ends with Yossarian accepting his situation and not trying to escape, is very much redemption is gained through suffering theme, which is very culturally Christian in context. And I think the ending of the book, in which Yossarian decides to walk out and leave, is a very Jewish philosophy, which there is no suffering. It's just suffering. Usually it doesn't really, you can try to do good things, but the suffering doesn't make you a good person. It's your actions that are kind of show who you are as a person.
Yeah, it's super interesting because the show also changes a bit of like the context of the situation that Yossarian is in. Yossarian ultimately decides that he's going to fuck off out of there for a lot of reasons, because a lot of shit has gone down, but also because ultimately the higher ups try to get him to make a deal where he's going to go back to the States, he's going to make them look good, he's going to say nice things about them, and he decides that that would be a betrayal of the other people in his squadron. And then his decision in the book is that his response to that is going to be to like leave and just get out of the situation. And then they really made like a very specific decision to alter that ending. And I can't imagine why you would make that decision unless you didn't get the point of the original ending, or as you say, you're making a very conscious decision to make it more culturally palatable.
Yeah, is the ending of the movie the same as the book?
It is, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know there's been multiple academic art. I found one, it's called like Joseph Heller's Jewish War novel or whatever, but it was behind a paywall, so I couldn't read it. But I would love to read that. Yossarian, you are Jewish, even if it was not explicit.
So next we should talk about Milo, because you love Milo, and I also think he's really interesting. So maybe you want to start us off?
Yeah, I guess I've kind of already said some of my main points about his representation of capitalism and the military-industrial complex. And I also really think, as I said earlier before we started recording, is that Milo, he's almost a living anachronism, because he lives in the 40s, but he does things like his slogan is "What's good for the syndicate is good for the country," which is a slogan that was developed post-war by General Motors. I think what's good for General Motors is good for the country, which is, I have to really play on that. Also, there is a whole segment, the Great Loyalty Oath Crusade, which is also a commentary on communism and McCarthyism in America, and wouldn't really make sense for someone in the 40s, which I think is very interesting, because it shows very much a conscious decision on Heller's part to make him this representation of war profiteering. And to this day, I still cannot see anything that says M&M without thinking about Milo, his influence.
Yeah, I enjoyed in the movie, I'm pretty sure it was the movie and not the show, anytime Milo would say something about, oh, I'm buying this product from here and I'm selling it over there, and this is how I'm making a profit. Anytime he starts to explain how the syndicate works, they happen to be passing by like a jet
That's
engine.
in the show.
Also in the movie. So I don't know if like they borrowed that from the movie, but yeah. So anytime it's just like there's like a jet engine or whatever. And so like his explanation, it doesn't matter what it is, because ultimately, if you look at like the stock market or whatever, it's like so many of these things have quote unquote meaning because we agree they have meaning, not because they like intrinsically make sense. And so like it doesn't really matter what his explanation is. Like fundamentally at the end of the day, he's making all of these decisions there's a part where on the one side, he's contracted with the Germans to protect a bridge, but he's also contracted with the American army to bomb the bridge. And it doesn't make any sense, but like, that's capitalism, baby. Like, if you can make a profit, that's what you do, whether or not it makes logical sense.
Mm-hmm. And also, kind of, again, building off some of what we already said, it's a very anti-establishment and almost like cynical take, I think, because it's again like you can fight the system, but you can't really escape it. Like I guess Yossarian, we have the ambiguous ending where Yossarian escapes, but Milo still runs away with all the money at the end. There's no quote quote just punishment for him as Yossarian and other characters think he deserves. He's praised and rewarded for what he did and not punished. Even after he basically burns down the entire base, at the end he's still, he doesn't like get in trouble for that, even though it is actively in action against the Air Force, and it's because the Germans told him to do it.
It's good for everybody. That's the point.
So I think in a more like realistic scenario, he would probably end up being charged as like a German spy or whatever. But since this is our satirical little world, nothing happens to him.
And we're supposed to understand that loyalty to the market will always supersede loyalty to any country or anything else that we might imagine matters.
Wait, is this the right moment to talk about every country worth dying for or blah, 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 that whole Nately part? Because that's one of my, let me pull up the quote. Hold on. Yeah, there's a part where Nately is having a conversation with the guy who runs the brothel where his sex worker girlfriend works. And they're kind of having a conversation about like morality and loyalty to the war. And the old man tells him, Nately says something about like loyalty to the country is more important. And then the old man says, and I quote, "What is a country? A country is a piece of land surrounded on all sides by boundaries, usually unnatural. Englishmen are dying for England. Americans are dying for America. Germans are dying for Germany. Russians are dying for Russia. There are now 50 or 60 countries fighting in this war. Surely so many countries can't be all worth dying for." Well, Nately is kind of insistent on dying for America. The old man kind of sees it as this, like, what is this? It doesn't mean anything. We just arbitrarily decided that this is a border and this is a country. And the only thing that really matters is like your own kind of individual life and death and what you do, which I also think goes back to what I was saying about the great American Jewish novel. He's kind of saying about how Italy doesn't really, it's like, oh, what is Italy? Italy is an idea. Italy isn't actually, it doesn't matter what happens to Italy. What matters is like someone's going to win the war, then someone else is going to come back and just put in a new regime. What is it all? The cyclical nature of the cycles, all that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, he's talking about how Americans and Germans are still dying in this war, but the Italians are out. They're all going to survive. So who's the real winner kind of thing. And he also talks at length about how Rome crumbled, all these different empires crumbled. So what makes you think that America will last forever? And Nately's quite upset about that.
Yeah, also he's upset about, they have a trade-off. It's better to die on your feet than live on your knees. And then Nately says, isn't it?
I think Nately says, better to die on your feet than live on your knees. And the other guy says, well, actually, it's better to live on your feet than to die on your knees. And Nately's like, your way doesn't make sense. And the old man's like, your way doesn't make sense. So we should probably talk about women in this book. I did a bit of crawling through the internet, trying to find reviews of this book and just people's general thoughts. I was just curious. I even delved into the dark recesses of Reddit. And I just find a lot of people don't talk that much about how Heller treated women in this book. So yeah, would love to maybe get into that a little bit.
I would love to ask you a question, all of you, and myself as well. Because it's satire, does satire excuse talking about women in a derogatory way?
I was wondering the same thing.
What I would say is that Heller's satire is so smart when it comes to so many other things. Like something will happen and then immediately he'll just super cleverly turn it around. But we never sort of get that second thing when he's talking about women. It's like he talks about the women in that way and then we never get the, oh, but here's like the clever, funny, like satirical thing about it. He just writes them that way and then that's how it is. And it's just super interesting to me how we see Yossarian at the end is so horrified by this rape that Arfi has committed. And he's supposed to be, you know, kind of on the side of women in this case. But then earlier in the book, there's definitely a scene where he sexually assaults Nurse Duckett. And so that kind of feels like a weird, when I read the book, like that almost feels like a bit discordant to me. I don't know if you guys feel the same way.
Yeah, I agree mostly. Also, just to add on, it's interesting, the whole thing with Nately's for lack of a better word, name for her, kind of, in that she blames Yossarian for what happened to Nately, that he dies a horrible death. And she spends the last third of the book trying to kill him in increasingly absurd ways. I think that's the only time our women actually get to bite back. But even then, it's almost still treated as, oh, silly women. This is how she does. She treats this man. He's so innocent, like our hero.
Yeah.
So
it's just, he's so good at speaking truth to power and confronting all these oppressive systems in other ways. And then he doesn't really seem to hit that last step of also questioning the power structures that women live under.
The TV show does try and give these women a little bit more character, but they're also still just the objects of the men's affections, with maybe the exception of Inez, which is Natalie's girlfriend's little sister. I don't know if she's named in the book or not. I can't remember.
she's not.
They call her Natalie's
No.
kid sister the whole time. Or, sorry,
But-
Natalie's horse kid sister.
Yeah. In the show, they try and make Yossarian kind of feel for this girl a little bit more than they do in the book.
Well,
Yeah.
I think in the book, she just keeps trying to climb into bed with them, and Natalie's horse has to keep throwing her out of the room.
Yeah, and in the show, like I wrote down, it's like she tries to proposition him once. He says no, and he tries to bond with her as a person and be like, "Oh, you shouldn't be here. Why are you? This is so bad for a kid, you poor thing." But I think book Yossarian wouldn't do, and it gives more agency to her as a character.
Does Natalie want to marry the prostitute in the book?
Yeah, he proposes to her.
Oh, he does. Okay. All right.
Yeah, even when I was joking about it earlier, just like the fact that she doesn't even have a name, she's just called Natalie's whore. And even the women who do have names in the book, I remember specifically for some reason the description of Nurse Duckett, but I'm pretty sure it's this way with all the women where you get this description of them. Invariably, you find out what their tits look like. Like, Joseph Heller will never introduce to you a female character without giving you some explicit details of what her tits look like, whether or not that's relevant to anything that happens. And then afterwards, you might find out a little more about her, but like ultimately, none of these women, I mean, in as much as a lot of these characters get a lot of life breathed into them, in as much as they are caricatures, I find like the women are just like so flat.
The maid with the lime green panties stands out. She's literally just there to be a sex object, and the only thing that gets focused on her is what her underwear looks like, and not anything else.
Like many things, the book was written when it was written, and I'm sure that a lot of this is based on Heller's experiences with how servicemen treated the locals during World War II. But yeah, I was actually doing a little bit of reading about some of Heller's other work, and it seems like he develops in this regard. Like some of the later stuff that he's written is like a bit more sensitive about sexual assault and that kind of stuff. So I just find it interesting that it's sort of as good as the satire is in the rest of this book. That felt incomplete to me, this like treatment of women. I didn't feel like he really like hit the note on that one.
I feel like if he'd written that today, or if anyone would write satire today, this wouldn't fly. It only flies because it was written when it was written, and it gets excused because it's written when it was written. I don't think it would come out today.
Well, and notably, both adaptations leave out him sexually assaulting Nurse Duckett. So
Yes.
Yeah. In the show, I just remember like they have more of an actual relationship, and she more consents to being with him and around him. And in the book, it's where he's like doing advances on her, and she doesn't reciprocate.
yeah. Okay. Is there anything else that we should talk about comparing to the movie or the book that we missed out on?
I guess maybe one other thing we could maybe talk about is about Chief White Half-Oat, if you want to talk about that or not.
Sure. Yeah. So in the original novel, there's, aside from, Yossarian's unnamed potential Jewishness, but there's really only one other character that is racially, ethnically, religiously separate, and it's Chief White Half-Oat, who's sort of a racist character of an indigenous person. But in the same stroke, Heller also uses this character to condemn the government taking land from indigenous people for the oil and gas that's underneath. And so it's kind of interesting. They also left him out of both adaptations for probably obvious reasons.
Yeah, I think it works in the book because instantly clear what kind of character Heller meant to create from that. But then if you put it in a modern setting, it's just offensive as hell.
Yeah, it wouldn't work.
It is in the book as well, but it's satire, so it gets that kind of, can we get away with this in satire? I guess we can.
Yeah,
Well,
it gets crossing a very fine line, I think, especially as the book has aged. And I think that's going kind of what some of the else you were saying about other parts of the book being unadaptable and how a lot of it works better on paper, like the commentary about Chief White Half-Oat and also Major Blank de Coverley, as I might have said earlier. So
yeah, it's kind of disappointing because you get where Heller's going, but also all of the white characters get caricatured in ways that have to do with like how they fit into like this establishment hierarchy. So all of the figures in the brass are just over the top incompetent or over the top neurotic or over the top whatever. And all of Yossarian's friends, or maybe if they are stereotypical or caricaturish, they are so in a way that has to do with like sort of different archetypes of personalities. Whereas Chief White Half-Oat is an over the top stereotype because he's indigenous. Instead of giving him like, oh, he's an over the top stereotype in this particular way, it's like, oh, well, it's just easy that he's indigenous. And so we'll give him all the trappings of being an indigenous person without any like sort of corresponding like character behind that. I don't know.
And then he dies for a joke, basically, too. Even some of like the other characters who are Yossarian's friends who are kind of characters and jokey, a bunch of them have serious death that's supposed to impact Yossarian, his characterization, like Nately and McWatt and Kid Sampson and Dunbar. And then Chief White Half-Oat's reoccurring thing is, I'm going to die of pneumonia. And then he dies of pneumonia. Just like, haha, wasn't that funny? So it's kind of not treated the same as everyone else's deaths. He's like kind of brushed aside.
Yeah, it's not a perfect book. But yeah, I mean, fundamentally, yes, it's like you said, there's pieces of it that are unadaptable based on the two adaptations they've attempted that kind of fell on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of like loyalty to the source material. Neither one super works as an adaptation. Perhaps at some point we'll see a Catch-22 made for the screen that really captures the spirit of the novel, but like, man, I think it would be hard. We asked Phoebe to bring some of her favorite World War II novels to recommend to you guys because I know she's read quite a lot of them. So yeah, take it away. What would you recommend?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd recommend Len Deaton's Bomber because, again, it's an interesting compare contrast with Catch-22 as some like the same themes. It's a very different aspect of a bomber crew, and also from the British perspective. It's also from around the same time. So expect some things about characterization of women. Her childlike beauty comes to mind, but it's an enjoyable book, I think. And then from also the British perspective, The Cruel Sea, which is from the 50s, is also a movie, and it follows the crew of a British escort ship through the Battle of the Atlantic. And throughout the entire war, it kind of follows some of the main characters, like main people on the crew and what happens to them.
We haven't done too many boat movies yet, or boat books, so that could be a thing.
Yeah. And then I would also, from the European side, from the translated books side, of course, obligatory Stalingrad and Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. They are both also a variation on the great Jewish World War II novel. And they're kind of an attempt at the war and peace of the 20th century written by a former war correspondent who was there during the Battle of Stalingrad. And they're kind of technically meant to be read together, but you can probably read one or the other and not miss much. But I read both, would recommend reading both for the complete experience. And I'd also say another case of the unadaptable, because I know it's been tried once in Russia, but given censorship laws, they couldn't. And it's just such a big, heavy thing to tackle. And also, like, it is a bit of a victim of, this is written under Stalin, and it shows there is some obvious censorship, but it still really hits hard on the themes about humanity, individuality in war, and fighting against the establishment. And the other one would be, which also I think you should talk about because there's a movie, Every Man Dies Alone, or Alone in Berlin. It's been translated as both. And it's about kind of a middle-aged German couple whose son dies in the war. They start realizing, oh, maybe Nazis are bad after all. And they start writing these postcards and distributing them around Berlin that have like message of resistance on them. They hope that people will find. And it's the last 100 pages, I cried. So you could probably figure out what happens to them because it's based on a true story. But it's also written right after the war, which I found interesting because plenty of ex-Nazis probably read the book, and very moving and very effective. I really enjoyed it. And finally, personal favorite, Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which is also kind of another great American Jewish novel. It's about two cousins, one's American, one's Czech, who in the 40s, 50s, New York City at start writing comic books. Both people who I've made read it have loved it. So take that for recommendation. And also all of them except Cavalier and Clay are written by people who are actually there. I think it helps make a book more readable for me if it's written by someone like Heller, who was actually there. Because a lot of some of the ones that were written later, some of them come across as a bit flat, even though like all their products of their time, I found it more effective that way personally. I'm just very picky.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I would feel the same way, I think. Mart, do you want to talk about the rating? Just because I feel like I've talked so much already.
Sure. Today we are going to rate the book and the TV show. I've made the other two people on the show humor me and also rate the TV show, but we're going to rate it Milo Mondays out of 10. Who wants to go first? Because not me.
Well, I can go first, I guess. I probably should have thought about this. I say it every time. I'm like, I should have thought about this. Okay, well, I'll rate the TV show first, I guess, since we're doing that. I'm going to rate it if it was a standalone war drama, I would rate it higher because it's a Catch-22 adaptation and they made some changes that I feel are just fundamentally in opposition to what the book is supposed to be about. I'm gonna rate it maybe a 6.5 Milo Mondays out of 10. It's an enjoyable enough watch. It's just not what it should be, I think. And as for the book, I'm going to rate it 9 Milo Mondays out of 10. I really enjoy this book. I've read it a couple of times. I find it really funny. Heller is a very able satirist. Yeah, definitely an enjoyable read for me, and one I'll probably circle back to.
You basically read my mind because mine were pretty much the same, around 6 Milo Mondays out of 10 for the show because of the reasons we've already talked about to death. But I thought, as we've said, it looks very good and it would work better as a war drama, but also banger soundtrack and great performances from, I don't remember who plays Milo. I'm so sorry.
No, I agree with you. He's a good actor. He did a good job.
Daniel David Stewart as Milo and Christopher Abbott as Yossarian both did an excellent job. And yeah, but for the book, I would also probably give it somewhere like 8.5, 9 Milo Mondays out of 10 because the beginning can get very verbose and dense. And I'm not sure if I could reread. It's an effort. It's a whole thing. But I definitely think it works. It's a classic for a reason.
And that just leaves me, which I feel you're gonna feel this one coming. I'm gonna rate the book a 7 Milo Mondays out of 10. One, because I couldn't finish it in time, even though I had like a couple of weeks to read it. And two, because I maybe just don't feel smart enough for satire, so that's on me. And I'll rate the TV show as a separate thing, because I feel very much like it should be. I'll give it 8 Milo Mondays out of 10 as a separate thing and not as a adaptation, even though it is one. I know I'm kind of cheating. But I do really enjoy it, so I'm just going to give it an 8 because I enjoy it.
Also, I want to say that I saw Milo Monday on Tumblr at first, but I don't remember who posted it. So
we have gently borrowed it. We'll return it to them unharmed, whoever it was.
Yeah.
But I mean, Mart, I think part of it is, and I think we talked about this offline at the beginning, but part of it is definitely that like the book is firmly, a lot of the jokes make more sense if you were around in America in the mid-century, and none of us were. So, so there will be like a few things if you're reading it and you're, someone born later and not American that will go over your head. But yeah.
I'm American, but born in the 21st century. So am I your first American on the show? I feel honored.
Gosh, no, we had Beck who talked about Fury with us, but...
You're definitely the youngest person we've had on the show.
Oh, yeah, that's probably true, yeah. Well, thanks very much, Phoebe. We had a really good discussion, I think. This book there's so much. You could talk about it for hours and hours and hours. But I feel like we did a pretty good job of touching on a few important things and also not getting so in-depth that people fell asleep driving while listening to this. So you can listen to Rosie the Reviewer wherever you get your podcast. You can rate us 5 stars. You can share this episode with a friend or 10 friends or however many friends you might have. 50 friends, who can say? You can visit our website, rosiethereviewer.com, and you can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast.
Also, if you want to be a guest on Rosie the Reviewer, we do welcome smart people onto our show.
Thanks so much for listening.
Bye!
Bye.